So Seth, why don't we go ahead and get an intro from you and jump in?
Sure, sure. So I am one of the co-hosts of Absolute AppSec. I have been talking about secure code review and performing secure code review for close to 20 years at this point. We'll dig into kind of the different topics that we've seen in code review. I'll start sharing mine and what we try to do when we're performing a code review. But as far as my background goes, I actually started as a developer years and years ago at iOmega. If anyone remembers the zip drive people, that's where I was. I did web development, early kind of DevOps style tooling for promoting code from environment to environment. I was not responsible for the click of death. That was not me. If you lost data, hold the pitchforks, please. But that's where I'm coming from. And yeah, happy to be here today. All right. So we are here today to talk about modern secure code review. And like I said previously, I've been doing code reviews for close to 20 years from a security perspective. It's one of the main topics, the main targets that I've had over the course of my career. As I said, I started as a developer, but I moved into application security in the early application security days very quickly. And this was one of the topics, one of the tasks that has been underserved for a number of years. And there are specific reasons for that. Part of it is that it's hard and it takes a lot of effort. And so the framework that we're going to be talking about today helps actually reduce that effort because it gives you a pattern to follow, a framework to follow that allows you to speed up the process and concentrate on what matters. So first things first, what is a secure code review? At a high level, a code review is attempting to do two things. First of all, eliminate vulnerabilities in source, identify edge cases. It's very similar to a normal code review. A secure code review is just looking for security issues as opposed to just coding issues in general. But that does require a little bit of specific training and specific context in order to know what to look for. On the flip side, secure code review also validates security controls that should be in place. So the questions that the poll that was run by Jen previously about security design and requirements versus secure code review is very apropos to what we do in a security code review or a secure code review, because we're trying to validate that those security controls exist, they are appropriate, and they are actually effective when we are doing a secure code review. There are other AppSec tasks that perform or align with secure code reviews, things like penetration testing and DAST and SAST scanning. But secure code review is a specialized skill set that can be used and is very effective at identifying some of these issues that we don't necessarily get out of just putting together a secure design or scanning with the DAST tool, because we still have breaches that exist. And a lot of those breaches occur because of the code that has been written. Now, vibe coding, as Dimitri got into, is a whole different bag of worms when it comes to secure code reviews. And we can talk about that a little bit if you have questions related to it and how we apply these same principles to that. Now, after I talk about what is a secure code review, I want to talk about why. Why do we actually do them? The question I often get asked by clients, by internal teams is, isn't SAST enough? Don't the static analysis tools cover this? And this was very much the approach that I had and the response that I got from people early on in my career. We've got a static analysis tool. It covers this from a code review perspective. But what we found is that those static analysis tools were weak in very critical portions of identifying vulnerabilities and identifying security controls. The current set of SaaS tools, they cover known bad patterns very well. I deal with them constantly, and they are good at identifying certain sets of vulnerabilities, specific vulnerabilities in code, things that use a source to sink trace, that we have known bad patterns for. What they don't catch are things like authorization flaws. It's very hard for a SaaS tool to have any sort of context on how authorization happens within an application. And without training, without writing, SEMGRIP rules that are very specific to your organization, to your code base, a SaaS is going to have a hard time validating those sorts of security controls. Now, AI is solving some of this, but there are always business logic flaws. There's always edge cases that a SaaS can't necessarily cover, and even a DAST won't find without very, very specific tuning to that use case. So secure code reviews are really about those unknown unknowns. This is the stuff that keeps your management, keeps your engineers up at night. Those hard to find vulnerabilities that once they're uncovered are very obvious and actually are critical to protecting data. A lot of the breaches that we have nowadays come from a lack of security configurations, a lack of business logic controls, access controls that should be in place, missing access controls, all of these things that could be caught by doing code reviews when you are concentrated on the right aspects. And that is one of the things that I struggled with early in my career, is making sure that I don't go on side quests, that I don't go down rabbit holes when I'm doing code reviews on patterns that are easily identified by other tools and other resources that I have under my control. So the philosophy here is that we just want to increase our likelihood of success. And the success is something that is risk-based. We are prioritizing the amount of time that we have to look at code based on the risks to that code and to that organization. We want to be as comprehensive as possible. Again, applying that prioritization to the lens of the code review. So comprehensive is not necessarily we're reviewing every single line of code for security issues, although that would be nice to have. There's very few organizations that will actually allow you the amount of time that would be needed to comb through 2 million lines of code for every possible vulnerability that exists. AI tools, I'm going to talk about this, generative AI, a little bit later, will actually give us some of that coverage and make us more effective. To both Dimitri and Jivan's point, it is changing the game for us from a secure code review perspective, but it still takes some expertise to know what we want to be looking at and where to target different, for different controls within the application. And then finally, easily consume notes and a report. Like, we want to be able to generate something that developers can intake. We need to put out tickets. We need to be involved in their flow, as opposed to generating a PDF that no one wants to look at, or generating results in a dashboard that the developers don't have access to. On top of that, we want our review framework to be language agnostic. We need to be able to apply our actions to any code that's thrown our way. Now, any AppSec engineer is going to have their favorites, their languages that they are very good at, that they've seen before, that they've spent a lot of time in, and that's great. But what I've found over my career is that I get thrown things on a daily basis that I may or may not have seen before. So I need a repeatable process. I need a way to become an expert quickly, whether that is through reading documentation for a framework, through asking questions of a AI co-pilot. But however I apply that, it has to be a repeatable process, and it has to allow me to come up to speed quickly when I'm analyzing a code base. Within the SDLC, the code review differs, pretty heavily from what a security design, security training is. But it does fit within that develop test functions. If we're looking at a standard waterfall SDLC, that's what I wanted to highlight here. But it's basically explaining the difference between what a secure code review is versus these other AppSec tasks that we implement. Now, if we don't do code reviews during that develop phase, it is often that we actually miss vulnerabilities. And the second poll that was out there, like that, features are often not reviewed for secure code. before they actually go out the door. I mean, it seemed like it was what 30% or so of the respondents actually said so. That is very common from what I'm seeing. So we have a gap. We have a huge gap in our security SDLC when we're not actually analyzing things from that perspective. Now, yes, SAS scan, SCA tools, they will get us a portion of the way there. But again, those unknown unknowns are the things that can bite us and have bitten companies in the past. So if we're looking, I was just breaking this down a little bit. During the develop phase, that's where code reviews should happen. Security specific code reviews can happen there or within the test phase, or even before launch if that's where it needs to occur. Again, as we push left in the waterfall methodology or the waterfall SDLC, the better our security is going to be because we're getting involved sooner within that process. If we apply and we catch things during the development phase and are able to change the requirements, change the design there, it is a small jump to actually fix those vulnerabilities. But if we wait until launch, guess what? It's going to cost us a lot more to go back and redesign or re-implement features because of problems within the code itself. Okay, so that brings us to the code review methodology itself. Now, again, remember the idea here is that we want to prioritize our activities. We want to prioritize based on the risk to the code itself and not necessarily be driven by a checklist that has no context for the risks that are coming into an application. So I want to spend my time where it is most important. Now, that being said, there are what we call non-negotiables within this methodology. I've got my general purpose checklists of things that I will generally look at and I will apply them. But, these first two items on the left-hand side here are really non-negotiables when we're looking at any code from a secure code review perspective. Right? We always want to understand what the code is doing, this application overview. We want to understand the risks and the threats to that code before we dive in and actually start looking for vulnerabilities. And then we're going to gather information about the code base itself that helps us build context about what the application is doing. And we're going to keep circling back on this every so often as we perform our checks. AI can help us through a lot of this, and I will show an example of that as we get towards the end of the presentation here. But just remember that information gathering is critical to building that context. I've had multiple times over the course of my career, and I still have a problem with diving too deep too soon when a new code base is given to me, because I know, hey, we always find authentication flaws. So I'm going to start looking at the authentication flows on how users are identified by the code. And all of a sudden, I've spent an hour or 2 hours looking at authentication routines when I don't really understand the risks to the application itself, which, authentication is always important, but this may or may not be the spot that I should be spending that time. And as a third party that looks at a lot of code, my time is extremely restricted in doing a secure code review. I don't have extra time to spend on non-essential portions of the application. That makes us less profitable, to be frank, as a consultancy, if I spend my time in the wrong areas. And so I've got to be very disciplined. And one of the things about a secure code review methodology is staying disciplined, making sure that you're spending time where it is appropriate. Now, one of the things that actually helps here is this kind of tactical framework that we've put together. Initially, there's like a more strategic methodology that is in place that we are following loosely as we are performing a code review methodology. But this tactical framework is what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, right? Every day I'm opening a file, I've got like notes that I'm taking about the code base, I'm identifying that application purpose, I'm mapping out the application, and then I'm brainstorming risks. As I build that list of review items, yes, this is where I spend most of my time, I am constantly updating my application purpose, my mapping of the application, brainstorming of risks throughout the course of a code review, because the context is critical to actually understanding whether or not the controls and whether or not the vulnerabilities that I'm looking at during the review items that I'm checking are effective or not. And then I'm performing those reviews. Like doubling back is just this constant activity that is performed during the course of a code review. So this is the tactical framework on the ground on a daily basis, what you will be doing in a code review. But from a general principle perspective, make sure you give yourself adequate time for any session. 10 minutes is usually not enough. I usually work in 2 to 3 hour blocks when I'm looking at code, because it takes that long to get into a frame, build the context map in my mind to be able to check things off and trace the code appropriately. I work in small chunks over the course of a code review, like 2-3 week code review, where I do 2 hours at a time. I will, stay on task with current objective and try not to go down those rabbit holes or go on those side quests where I'm looking for SQL injection when I know it's not a vulnerability, or there's a way to actually identify that in a different manner. Don't make it personal, right? Like, just because you're not finding vulnerabilities doesn't mean they don't exist. It means that the developers did a good job, and that is, it's worth it to give some kudos when that is the case. Ask questions about the code. If you have access to the developers, make sure to ask questions about what keeps them up at night or where you should be looking, because that will help and will speed up the prioritization and context that you had. Early on in my career, I was doing a code review of it was a bunch of microservices behind an application. And, after about a week and a half into a 3-week engagement, we found SQL injection in one of the microservices. Great, this is an awesome thing. From a testing perspective, that we've identified this risk, we were able to validate it, use SQL map, dump the entire database, and of course, we notified the developers immediately that we had confirmed a SQL injection vulnerability, got them onto a call, and once I opened up this call with the lead developer and a couple other developers that we had contact with on this team, first thing I said was, hey guys, we have found SQL injection. Before I could say anything else, the lead developer actually piped up and said, oh, did you find it here? Pointing at the exact microservice where we had identified SQL injection, completely taking the wind out of my sails. And, at the time I was deflated, but it taught me a good lesson that had I just asked the question up front about concerns that this lead developer had, he would have pointed directly at this microservice, and we would have had the context to go in and identify that sooner on in the engagement. So ask those questions, talk to the developers, don't be shy about it. There is no reason as an AppSec engineer that you have to understand a complete code base to go and do a code review. And you're not going to, you don't spend the time in there. At least as a third party, we don't. So we have to ask these questions. Now, finally here, like documentation is your friend. I should add to this that AI copilots are your friend. They will speed up this process, build the code, run the tests, look at the unit tests. Unit tests are a great way to gain context about a code base, because it points at what developers or organizations find most important that has to function in the code base. So if there's flaws anywhere in the tested code within those unit tests, that is a good place to actually surface findings. Okay, so those are the general principles. Overall application overview, risk assessment. I'm going to go through these quickly. I know I'm talking a lot. And these slides will be available. There is even more content that's available. I'll show the repository where we host a full breakdown of the methodology here as we get done today. But I'm just going to highlight these very quickly. So application overview and risk assessment. Initially, we just want to build a portrait of the application, how it accomplishes its tasks. So how does it, what's its behavior? What's its technology stack? We want to do some app archaeology into the dependencies, what's important, what security libraries are being pulled in, is there middleware, or does the application did the developers actually build those security controls themselves? And part of this is, we'll go very quickly once we've actually pulled up things like the README and other places. But this is just general, like looking through the code base itself, looking at developer documentation, looking at build instructions will point you at a lot of this if you don't have access to the developers to give you this information. And then we're going to perform some more information gathering on the application itself. We've got to create an attack surface and a map of the application on how users interact with it. No application lives by itself. It's taking in data somehow, it's spitting it out somewhere else. We have to understand that and build that into our brain in order to understand the risks that are associated with it. And then along those lines, we're going to also, in this phase, identify the authorization patterns within the application, because that is so critical to a code review. Now, there's a further section where we actually do authorization checks, but during the information gathering phase, we've learned that identifying those functions that perform access control for getting into the functionality of the application speeds up the code review process. So again, this is a non-negotiable. This is something we do with every application, and it's going to depend on how that application is built. Like, we have to understand what that behavior and technology stack looks like in order to build out what those authorization functions are. A mobile application has a much different access control mechanism than a web application, but we can still apply the secure code review process to either of those, and as long as we identify these different pieces. So we're going to map out the application there. And then we will take the information, the context that we've learned, we'll create checklists based on these general purpose application security or security controls, and we'll actually perform the reviews for each of these. I'm not going to step through each of these today. Suffice to say, as we built out this framework, we based it upon AAA was the first thing that we talked about: authorization, authentication, and auditing, because these are critical security controls that exist in any product that is out there. We have to figure out who the users are, what they're allowed to do, and what they actually did. If we're missing any one of those pieces, depending on the application, again, the context of that application and its risk, there are going to be vulnerabilities. So we'll build out checklists based on the map of the application, based on the risk that we actually have, and run through and check to make sure that that a user is authenticating correctly, that the cookies are set up properly, that one user cannot access another user's data, the administrator role is put into place effectively, and that the logging actually exists and monitoring is built into the application itself. From there, we talked about actually doing a CIA triad as well as we were building out the methodology. But what we found is that over the course of our careers, or my career, right, that there were very specific vulnerabilities that popped up again and again, and they were usually related to injection, so some sort of input handling, data handling by the application, cryptographic flaws that exist. And we're not just talking about HTTPS, but we're talking about protection of passwords, protection of sensitive information, and then configuration flaws. The number of times that I find default credentials because someone is using some sort of a CRM tool or something else on top, or middleware layered into their application security or their application server, is non-trivial. And so this is where we've built those out. And you can get a full dump of these again in the repository that I will share here shortly. Authorization, these are the vulnerabilities that we're going to be looking through for each of the different review items. Insecure direct object reference. If you're familiar with the law, you've seen these before. Sensitive data exposure is pretty critical. That's where a lot of breaches happen. So we're always going to be at least including these overarching topics and then applying the different vulnerabilities, looking for the different vulnerabilities in the code specifically. Authentication, we find user enumeration flaws in probably 95% of the applications that we test. Whether or not it is considered critical or not depends on the application, but it is out there. Being able to know what emails are associated with an application just creates a target for credential stuffing and other phishing attacks. But authentication flaws are in most applications that we look at. Auditing, I get onto an auditing soapbox because it's one of those items that doesn't necessarily get enough credit, right? We often discount how few events we actually log, and we don't log the right things in order for the security operations team to be able to identify what is actually going on within the application. We have auditing logs for the whole OSI model up to layer 7, but we're not actually looking into the application itself deep enough to know what the attackers are doing, and it causes problems further on down the road. Injection vulnerabilities, we've already mentioned SQL injection. I've heard people talk about it today, but these are your standard source to sink traces that are in there. And yeah, they're flaws that continue to exist, even though they're usually pretty easy to remediate. Cryptographic analysis it is 2025. If anyone is rolling their own crypto nowadays, they kind of deserve what they get. But on top of that, a lot of the vulnerabilities that we've seen within the last 5 years have to do more with this insecure token generation, lack of protection of secrets within code. So anywhere where we're referencing keys or other things, that can be an issue. And then configuration review vulnerabilities. Like I said, insecure defaults I've seen so many times. Incomplete configurations, browsing to a blog component within middleware, and it's like, oh, you haven't set up the blog. Do you want to set an administrator password? Stuff like that happens all the time. And then vulnerable and outdated components. We could talk a lot about SCA. From the context of secure code review, it's not as critical of a feature because we've got other tools that actually cover it. Once you're through actually circling back into the application, reporting and retesting is critical, right? We have to document findings in a manner that can be understood by those developers. We've got to put it into their workflow. This is the whole point of what we're actually doing. The sooner that we can report, the better off we're going to be. And again, working with those engineering teams is very important, right? Like is what makes that actually possible. Now, from an AI perspective, I know I'm pushing time here. So context is what we want to build. We don't simply scan using the AI. That was my initial reaction as I was starting to play with generative AI and LLMs, but we ask specific questions to speed up our analysis. It's almost like I'm starting to use, whether it's ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot or Windsurf or Cursor, the AIs that are built into that, as an assistive tool to speed up my analysis. So there's two meanings that we've got for context within the understanding of generative AI, right? Like we've got context we provide to the generative AI about what we're looking for, and then the context we gain back to it that I'm going to document in my code review notes. And part of this is prompt engineering and learning over time how to actually send some data to, or send a prompt to the generative AI that gets us back results that we want to do. Now, I talked about non-negotiables as I started this presentation. And part of this, was the application behavior, the risk analysis that we do up front when we're looking at an application. But what we found is that a generative AI does a really good job of this, especially when you are logged into Cursor, you're using GitHub Copilot, you're using, whatever it is, as long as it has access to the full code base and go actually look at different markdown files, dependencies, everything else that's associated with that. So what would normally take me, 5 years ago as I was doing a code review, 3 to 4 hours to actually build out, I can accomplish within, you'll see here, right? Like I'm looking at a vulnerable task manager. This is an application that's pre-built, but I am asking Copilot, GitHub Copilot in this case, to actually break down the behavior profile of that application. And a lot of people here probably already played with ChatGPT or something else, but it's critical to ask like the right questions, and prompt engineering, comes into that. And you'll see that it's actually broken down that there are 2 different components within the application itself, and giving me back kind of a full list of things that I need to be checking for, and that I can put directly into my code review process. I'm not short-circuiting the well, I am short-circuiting the process, and I'm still going to read through this, and I'm still going to take it with a grain of salt. But this was incredibly quick. What I would normally have to go dig into requirements.txt, I'd have to go look at the README and do a number of different tasks in order to gain back this same information, was done within, what was that, 30 seconds? I mean, the video is only a minute long, right? But it has, it identifies very quickly. It looks like, oh, it looks like you've got this task management application, damn vulnerable LLM agent. That's great. That can be used to learn about LLMs. And, this is who it's actually intended for. Yeah, the user roles that are built into it, like, and put things into the, yeah, that just take a long time within the ID to identify this by myself. And, incredibly effective. We are using this on a daily basis now. Anybody that's in the code review consulting space is going to be, you're going to have to use this to speed up your own analysis, or you're going to, fall behind. Tips and tricks with AI, and a lot of this, again, is in the repository I'm going to share. Don't try to eat the whole elephant. That was my initial take, was try to break down the whole code base, put it into a vectorized database, and then ask questions about it. That was not effective, and I was not seeing good results out of that. But what I am seeing is more an agentic approach that it uses reflection is very effective there, right? So, what vulnerability exists in the code, specific code that I'm looking at, and then focus down on the different vulnerabilities, let the AI actually go trace through the code, but stick to the secure code review process. Like, if I apply the same checklist, the same review items, within the code base itself, I actually got, like, it is effective, and I'm speeding up my whole process. And then try different LLMs. They are improving quickly, so the new models often surprise in, number one, how quickly they can turn around a result, but also the analysis that is provided to you. So here are the resources that I spoke about. GitHub.com, Absolute AppSec. You can find the handouts repository. That's the whole framework broken down, all the checklists that I was talking about, even an expanded presentation that's a couple hundred slides. And then there is a harnessing LLMs repository in there that's examples of how to use generative AI as well.